Nobody is going to tell you this directly. Not your friends, not your family, not the people who raised you with the best intentions they had, not the culture that shaped everything you believe about what a man is supposed to want and how he is supposed to get it. But somebody needs to say it clearly. So here it is. Most men are operating with a map that no longer matches the territory. They were handed a set of instructions early in life. Work hard. Be a good person. Show up consistently. Invest your effort and your loyalty and your emotional energy into finding the right woman, building something together, and eventually the life you were promised will materialize. That story sounds reasonable. It sounds fair. It sounds like the kind of thing that should be true. But for a growing number of men today, reality looks nothing like that story, and the gap between what they were told to expect and what they are actually experiencing is creating a specific kind of frustration, a quiet, persistent confusion that most men carry alone because they were never given the language to name it, and because the culture around them has very little patience for a man who admits he is struggling to understand the rules of a game that changed without anyone telling him. This is about that gap, about what it actually contains, and about the clarity that becomes possible once a man is willing to look at it directly instead of waiting for it to resolve itself. Here is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of all of this. Most men were raised with expectations that were designed for a completely different world. Not a better world necessarily. Not a simpler one in every respect. But a world that operated under conditions that no longer exist in the same form. A world where social structures were more predictable, where the path from young man to established adult followed a recognizable sequence, where dating operated within a relatively contained environment, where the roles people played in relationships, whatever you think of those roles in retrospect, were at least clearly understood by most of the people involved. That world produced a certain set of instructions for how a man was supposed to navigate his life. Those instructions got passed down, and many men are still following them. The problem is that the conditions that made those instructions functional have changed dramatically. Economic independence has expanded in ways that restructured the foundation of why people formed relationships in the first place. Social norms have shifted faster than most people's internal frameworks can track. The platforms through which people now meet, evaluate, and communicate with each other have introduced dynamics that human psychology was never designed to navigate at this scale or speed, and nobody handed anyone a revised set of instructions. So a man shows up, following the map he was given, and finds that the map doesn't correspond to the landscape he's actually moving through. He does what he was told should work, and sometimes it doesn't. Not because he is broken, not because he is inadequate, but because he is applying outdated logic to a changed environment. Recognizing that is not an excuse. It is not a reason to stop trying or to fold into bitterness. It is simply the beginning of accurate thinking. And accurate thinking is the only foundation on which anything useful can be built. To understand why this gap exists at such a fundamental level, you have to look further back than modern dating culture. Further back than apps and social media and the specific social dynamics of the last decade or two. You have to look at the biological architecture underneath all of it. Human beings are operating with psychological hardware that was built over hundreds of thousands of years. The drives, the instincts, the reward systems, the deep social programming that governs how men and women relate to each other, none of it was designed for the world we currently inhabit. It was designed for an environment that was radically different. For the vast majority of human history, men's value was measured in brutally practical terms. Resources, physical capability, status within a group, the ability to protect and provide under conditions where protection and provision were genuinely matters of survival. A man who could deliver those things was a man worth choosing. Not because of some arbitrary social rule, but because those qualities directly determined whether a woman and her children would survive. That produced specific male behavioral tendencies: the drive to compete, to establish status, to accumulate resources and signal capability, to measure personal worth against other men and against the standards of the environment. These tendencies weren't flaws, they were adaptations. But here is what happened. The environment changed, completely and rapidly. Technology replaced physical labor as the primary driver of economic value. Legal and social systems created safety structures that reduced the practical dependence on any individual man's capacity for protection. Economic independence became available to individuals in ways that restructured the foundational logic of partnership, and the male psychology that was built for one world found itself operating inside a completely different one. Those old drives are still running: the need to establish worth, the desire to be chosen, the specific pain of being rejected or overlooked, the competitive comparison against other men. These responses are still fully operational in modern male psychology, but the environment in which they are running has changed so thoroughly that the behaviors they produce don't always generate the outcomes they were designed to create. That mismatch is at the root of much of what frustrates single men today. Not weakness, not failure, a set of instincts operating in conditions they were never built for. Understanding that distinction changes what you do with what you're feeling. Here is one of the most difficult realizations that single men eventually face, and most men face it alone, which is part of why it hits so hard. Effort does not guarantee outcome. This sounds obvious when stated plainly, but it runs directly against something that was embedded very deeply in how most men were raised to think about the world. The framework most men internalized is fundamentally transactional. Work hard enough and success follows. Invest enough time and results appear. Show up consistently, and the outcome you're working toward will eventually materialize. That framework is genuinely useful in many domains. In fitness, it works. Put in consistent work, apply progressive effort, results accumulate. In financial development, it works. Build skills, create value, compound the returns over time. In most goal-directed areas of life, consistent, intelligent effort does reliably produce movement toward the desired outcome. But relationships involve another person, and another person is not a system that responds to input with predictable output. She has her own history, her own psychology, her own desires and fears, her own vision for what she wants her life to look like. She has her own timeline and her own standards and her own internal framework for evaluating what she encounters. And none of those things are accessible to you in the way that your own effort is accessible to you. You can control how you show up. You cannot control how that landing registers. Many men spend years refusing to accept this, because accepting it means releasing the comfort of believing that enough effort equals guaranteed reward. It means sitting with the reality that you can do everything right and still not get the outcome you want, not because you failed, but because outcomes in relationships are not yours to control unilaterally. That realization, when a man finally allows it to land, is one of the most clarifying moments he will have, because it redirects his energy from trying to manufacture a specific outcome toward building a life that is genuinely worth living, regardless of what any particular person decides about him. That shift changes the entire game. The first rule that any single man who is serious about his own life must eventually internalize is this: self-respect cannot be outsourced. When a man's confidence depends on external approval, on whether a specific woman responds to him the way he hopes, on whether he is getting the validation from the dating environment that he believes he needs, his entire emotional state becomes reactive. He's living at the mercy of other people's choices. Every ignored message becomes evidence about his worth. Every rejection lands as a verdict. Every successful interaction temporarily fills a space that will be empty again the moment the validation stops. That is an exhausting and unstable way to live. And more importantly, it produces exactly the quality that makes genuine connection harder to find. Because desperation is visible, even when it's carefully concealed, even when a man is doing everything he can to present confidence on the surface. The underlying need leaks through in ways that people register without always being able to articulate. It shapes the quality of attention he gives, the pace at which he moves, the anxiety that hovers underneath his interactions. Self-respect that comes from internal stability looks and feels completely different. It isn't a performance. It isn't a mask worn to appear more appealing. It is a man who has built a genuine relationship with his own standards, who knows what he values and behaves in alignment with it, regardless of whether anyone is watching, who experiences rejection not as a verdict on his fundamental worth, but as information about compatibility. That kind of self-respect cannot be manufactured through technique. It is built by doing the real work, by developing actual skills, actual health, actual financial competence, actual character, by making and keeping commitments to yourself before you make them to anyone else. And once it is built from that foundation, it becomes the thing that most men spend years trying to fake. The second reality that single men must accept is closely related. Your attention is finite, and how you allocate it will determine almost everything about where you end up. Time, energy, focus, emotional availability. These are not unlimited. They are resources. Real, depletable resources that can be spent wisely or spent carelessly. Most single men have never done an honest accounting of where those resources actually go. The hours spent in low-quality interactions that lead nowhere but felt like progress at the time. The emotional energy consumed by situationships that had no real future but were comfortable enough to stay in. The mental bandwidth occupied by pursuing someone whose signals were consistently unclear but whose attention felt good enough to chase. These things have costs that never show up on any visible balance sheet, but they show up in the quality of the life that results. Every hour spent in a direction that doesn't serve you is an hour not spent building something that does. Once a man genuinely internalizes that, his decision-making about where to invest his attention changes completely. He stops saying yes to things out of habit or loneliness or the vague hope that something might develop. He starts treating his time and energy as the genuinely scarce and valuable resources they are. He becomes more selective, not out of arrogance, not out of a defensive posture toward the world, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that he cannot afford to be careless with the finite resources that determine the trajectory of his own life. That selectivity changes how he is perceived, and it changes who he attracts. Here is what happens when a man becomes genuinely comfortable being single. Something inside him shifts. The low-grade anxiety that ran underneath his interactions, the need to have a relationship in order to feel acceptable, in order to feel like his life is on the right track, in order to feel like he is enough by the standards the world handed him, that anxiety begins to dissolve. Not all at once, but piece by piece, as he builds a life that he actually values on its own terms. And when that anxiety dissolves, something clean takes its place. Clarity. He stops pursuing relationships out of pressure or loneliness, or the fear that being single past a certain age means something is wrong with him. He starts evaluating relationships based on what they actually are. Is this person genuinely compatible with who I am and what I am building? Does being around her add to the quality of my life or subtract from it? Do I respect her character? Does she bring stability and depth to the table, or does she introduce complexity and volatility? These questions are only available to a man who doesn't need the answer to be yes. When you need it to be yes, you find ways to see yes, even when the honest answer is no. When you don't need it to be yes, you can simply see clearly. And clear seeing is the foundation of every good decision, in relationships and in everything else. The goal stops being to find a relationship. The goal becomes building a life strong enough, grounded enough, meaningful enough in its own right, that any relationship entering it must genuinely add value to what is already there. That repositioning changes everything about how a man moves through the world. At some point along this path, if a man stays with it long enough, he arrives at a realization that reframes the entire experience of being single. Being single is not a waiting room. It is not a deficit state, not a problem requiring urgent solution, not evidence of failure, not something to be apologized for or embarrassed by or frantically resolved. It is an opportunity, possibly one of the most significant opportunities a man will have in his adult life. The opportunity to develop without distraction, to build health and discipline and financial competence without dividing his attention, to discover what he actually values when no one else's preferences are shaping his choices, to become genuinely acquainted with who he is when he isn't performing for anyone. Men who use this period deliberately, who treat it as an investment rather than a sentence, emerge from it changed in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, but immediately apparent to anyone who encounters them. They carry themselves differently, not because they are trying to project anything, but because they have spent real time building something real. Their confidence has a foundation. Their standards have a basis. Their sense of self doesn't depend on external confirmation, because they have confirmed it through their own actions, their own discipline, their own daily choices made consistently over time. That is a kind of solidity that cannot be manufactured, cannot be shortcut, cannot be acquired through any strategy or technique. It is built only one way, by doing the actual work of becoming someone you respect. Before all of this resolves into clarity, there is one more distinction that must be understood: the difference between attraction and compatibility. Most men, for most of their younger years, pursue the first and hope it leads to the second. Sometimes it does, but not reliably. Attraction is real and it matters. The chemistry, the pull, the specific electricity of encountering someone who moves you. These things are not nothing. They are not superficial. They are part of what makes intimate connection worth pursuing in the first place. But attraction is not a guarantee of anything beyond itself. Two people can be intensely attracted to each other and be fundamentally incompatible in the ways that actually determine whether a relationship can sustain itself over years. Different values at the level that governs real decisions. Different visions for what a life should look like. Different ways of handling conflict, managing stress, relating to commitment. Different standards for what respect looks like in practice. Attraction doesn't resolve any of those differences. Compatibility is what determines whether two people can actually build something together that lasts beyond the initial spark. And compatibility is invisible in the early stages. It reveals itself slowly, through behavior over time, through how someone acts when things are difficult, through whether their actions consistently align with their stated values. A man who is operating from need, from the hunger for connection or validation, doesn't have the patience for that process. He resolves ambiguity in the direction of what he wants to believe. He overlooks incompatibility because the attraction is strong enough to make it seem workable. A man who has built genuine independence has the patience to wait. He can let things reveal themselves at their natural pace. He can see what is actually in front of him rather than what he hopes is there. And that patience, more than any other single quality, is what allows him to make a decision about a relationship that he will not regret years later. Here is where all of this lands. The brutal reality that single men must accept is not actually a brutal thing at all. It only feels brutal because it requires releasing the story that effort automatically produces outcome, that following the old instructions will generate the life those instructions promised, that the rules of a previous era still govern the world a man is actually living in. Releasing that story is uncomfortable, but what it leaves behind is something far more valuable than comfort. It leaves clarity. A man who understands the actual dynamics of the environment he is navigating stops wasting energy on strategies that don't work. He stops measuring his worth by the responses he gets from people who were never going to be compatible with him anyway. He stops chasing approval from an environment that was never going to deliver it on the terms he was taught to expect. And he starts doing something far more powerful. He starts building. He builds his health because he understands that physical discipline is one of the few things entirely within his control, and its returns compound across every area of his life. He builds his financial competence because he understands that economic stability creates options, and options create freedom. He builds his character because he understands that the only foundation worth standing on is one he constructed through actual choices, not performance. He builds a life, and from that life, with its genuine foundation, relationships become possible in a way they never were before. Not as a rescue, not as a completion, not as the external validation of a man who was waiting to feel like enough, but as a choice, made freely, made clearly, made from a position of genuine strength by a man who knows exactly what he has and what he is willing to share it with. That is the other side of the brutal reality, and it is available to any man willing to accept the first part clearly enough to build toward the second.